This video is a production from Dellas Corporate History. The history of London, the capital city of England and the United Kingdom, extends over 2,000 years. The City of London is the historic core of the Greater London metropolis, and is today its primary financial district, though it represents only a small part of the wider metropolis. In this video we will deal with the history of the city in the 20th century. Greater than 1900 to 1939. London entered the 20th century at the height of its influence as the capital of one of the largest empires in history, but the new century was to bring many challenges. London's population continued to grow rapidly in the early decades of the century, and public transport was greatly expanded. A large tram network was constructed by the London County Council, through the LCC tramways. The first motorbus service began in the 1900s. Improvements to London's overground and underground rail network, including large-scale electrification, were progressively carried out. During World War I, London experienced its first bombing raids carried out by German Zeppelin airships. These killed around 700 people and caused great terror, but were merely a foretaste of what was to come. The City of London would experience many more terrors as a result of both world wars. The largest explosion in London occurred during World War I, the Silvertown explosion, when a munitions factory containing 50 tons of TNT exploded, killing 73 and injuring 400. The period between the two world wars saw London's geographical extent growing more quickly than ever before or since. A preference for lower-density suburban housing, typically semi-detached, by Londoners seeking a more rural lifestyle, superseded Londoners' old predilection for terrace houses. This was facilitated not only by a continuing expansion of the rail network, including trams and the underground, but also by slowly widening car ownership. London's suburbs expanded outside the boundaries of the County of London, into the neighbouring counties of Essex, Hertfordshire, Kent, Middlesex and Surrey. Like the rest of the country, London suffered severe unemployment during the Great Depression of the 1930s. In the East End during the 1930s, politically extreme parties of both right and left flourished. The Communist Party of Great Britain and the British Union of Fascists both gained serious support. Clashes between right and left culminated in the Battle of Cable Street in 1936. The population of London reached an all-time peak of 8.6 million in 1939. Large numbers of Jewish immigrants fleeing from Nazi Germany settled in London during the 1930s, mostly in the East End. Labour Party politician Herbert Morrison was a dominant figure in local government in the 1920s and 1930s. He became Mayor of Hackney and a member of the London County Council in 1922, and for a while was Minister of Transport in Ramsay MacDonald's cabinet. When Labour gained power in London in 1934, Morrison unified the bus, tram and trolleybus services with the Underground, by the creation of the London Passenger Transport Board, known as London Transport. In 1933, he led the effort to finance and build the new Waterloo Bridge. He designed the metropolitan green belt around the suburbs and worked to clear slums, build schools, and reform public assistance. Greater than in World War II. During World War II, London, as many other British cities, suffered severe damage, being bombed extensively by the Luftwaffe as a part of the Blitz. Prior to the bombing, hundreds of thousands of children in London were evacuated to the countryside to avoid the bombing. Civilians took shelter from the air raids in underground stations. The heaviest bombing took place during the Blitz between the 7th of September 1940 and the 10th of May 1941. During this period, London was subjected to 71 separate raids receiving over 18,000 tons of high explosive. One raid in December 1940, which became known as the Second Great Fire of London, saw a firestorm engulf much of the City of London and destroy many historic buildings. St Paul's Cathedral, however, remained unscathed. A photograph showing the cathedral shrouded in smoke became a famous image of the war. Having failed to defeat Britain, Hitler turned his attention to the Eastern Front and regular bombing raids ceased. They began again, but on a smaller scale with the Little Blitz in early 1944. Towards the end of the war, during 1944–45, London again came under heavy attack by pilotless V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets, which were fired from Nazi-occupied Europe. These attacks only came to an end when their launch sites were captured by advancing Allied forces. London suffered severe damage and heavy casualties, the worst hit part being the Docklands area. By the war's end, just under 30,000 Londoners had been killed by the bombing, and over 50,000 seriously injured. Tens of thousands of buildings were destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of people were made homeless. Greater than 1945 to 2000. 3 years after the war, the 1948 Summer Olympics were held at the original Wembley Stadium, at a time when the city had barely recovered from the war. London's rebuilding was slow to begin. However, in 1951 the Festival of Britain was held, which marked an increasing mood of optimism and forward-looking. In the immediate post-war years, housing was a major issue in London, due to the large amount of housing which had been destroyed in the war. The authorities decided upon high-rise blocks of flats as the answer to housing shortages. During the 1950s and 1960s the skyline of London altered dramatically as tower blocks were erected, although these later proved unpopular. In a bid to reduce the number of people living in overcrowded housing, a policy was introduced of encouraging people to move into newly built new towns surrounding London. Through the 19th and in the early half of the 20th century, Londoners used coal for heating their homes, which produced large amounts of smoke. In combination with climatic conditions, this often caused a characteristic smog, and London became known for its typical London fog, also known as pea soupers. London was sometimes referred to as the smoke because of this. In 1952, this culminated in the disastrous Great Smog of 1952, which lasted for 5 days and killed over 4,000 people. In response to this, the Clean Air Act 1956 was passed, mandating the creating of smokeless zones, where the use of smokeless fuels was required. This was at a time when most households still used open fires. The act was effective. Young people in Carnaby Street in the 1960s, starting in the mid-1960s, and partly as a result of the success of such UK musicians as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, London became a centre for the worldwide youth culture, exemplified by the swinging London subculture which made Carnaby Street a household name of youth fashion around the world. London's role as a trendsetter for youth fashion continued strongly in the 1980s during the New Wave and Punk eras and into the mid-1990s with the emergence of the Britpop era. From the 1950s onwards, London became home to a large number of immigrants, largely from Commonwealth countries such as Jamaica, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, which dramatically changed the face of London, turning it into one of the most diverse cities in Europe. However, the integration of the new immigrants was not always easy. Racial tensions emerged in events such as the Brixton riots in the early 1980s. From the beginning of the Troubles in Northern Ireland in the early 1970s until the mid-1990s, London was subjected to repeated terrorist attacks by the Provisional IRA. The outward expansion of London was slowed by the war, and the introduction of the Metropolitan Green Belt. Due to this outward expansion, in 1965 the old County of London, which by now only covered part of the London conurbation, and the London County Council were abolished, and the much larger area of Greater London was established with a new Greater London Council (GLC) to administer it, along with 32 new London boroughs. Greater London's population declined steadily in the decades after World War II, from an estimated peak of 8.6 million in 1939 to around 6.8 million in the 1980s. However, it then began to increase again in the late 1980s, encouraged by strong economic performance and an increasingly positive image. London's traditional status as a major port declined dramatically in the post-war decades as the old Docklands could not accommodate large modern container ships. The principal ports for London moved downstream to the ports of Felixstowe and Tilbury. The Docklands area had become largely derelict by the 1980s, but was redeveloped into flats and offices from the mid-1980s onwards. The Thames Barrier was completed in the 1980s to protect London against tidal surges from the North Sea. In the early 1980s, political disputes between the GLC run by Ken Livingstone and the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher led to the GLC's abolition in 1986, with most of its powers relegated to the London boroughs. This left London as the only large metropolis in the world without a central administration. In 2000, London-wide government was restored, with the creation of the Greater London Authority (GLA) by Tony Blair's government, covering the same area of Greater London. The new authority had similar powers to the old GLC, but was made up of a directly elected mayor and a London Assembly. The first election took place on 4 May, with Ken Livingstone comfortably regaining his previous post. London was recognised as one of the 9 regions of England. In global perspective, it was emerging as a world city widely compared to New York and Tokyo.